Hello. In our lecture 3, we are going to talk about climate change. Now, this is not a new topic for you, so I guess that you might have discussed um, about climate change uh, in other papers, but also that is a topic that most of you are acquainted. So what I would like to do is to invite you to consider some key questions related to climate change and how they are important for human development. Now, I have put in our PowerPoint, I have put first a list of references you have there. Most of these papers are very easy to access. I will try also to provide PDFs for you. But before we start, I just wanted to mention one issue to you, which is the issue that given all evidence that you have seen, you probably have seen all those graphs where temperature is increasing and CO2 emissions, they have been increasing as well. The question is, how can we explain this climate change denial? And it's very interesting to see how there's a decline in public belief in global warming. There are some people who simply say, well, I'm really not sure, or they try to make it relative to other claims. So what can explain that? So I suggest to you two papers that discuss precisely this issue. I think the first one is the most straightforward. Say, look, this is ideological. This has nothing to do with climate change, with the evidence that comes with climate change. But you put together people who do not believe in regulation and people who believe in markets, and then you get the fossil fuels industry, and you get all the corporate world, especially the corporate world in America. Then they get together with these corporate think tanks, and then front groups and scientists that might have different ideas about climate change. Then they are all publicized by conservative media, such as, well, better not to mention anyone. It's there, it's in the paper. And then the politicians, they just use that as part of what they do, part of their politics. And there are even some groups which, like AstroTurf groups, that they pretend to be grassroots groups, but they are not. So they are funded by other groups and other people who do not want to be seen. So the first thing to understand is that this is really ideological and is very difficult if you want to try to understand climate change from an objective point of view, that sometimes it goes to the scientific arena, some of the discussions which are basically ideological. So that's the first point. But the second is that even if people, they do not have this hidden agenda, so they might have what's called the directional, motivated reasoning, which somehow is like heuristics. If you have seen this very interesting book by Comim on thinking fast and slow, you know that sometimes knowledge is something difficult to handle, and when we do not have an answer to a question, instead of saying we don't know, we just answer a different question. Politicians are very good in doing that. So this is a very important point, that not every time that you see someone denying climate change is because they have a hidden conservative agenda. It's because they might have some cognitive issues related to that, or they might believe in a form of climate conspiracies, or they might even doubt the source of credibility of that information. So we should not disconsider these issues, because they are part of the problem as they might become part of the solution. Yeah. But having said that, what I would like to suggest to you is that we have two important discussions related to climate change. One is a very utilitarian discussion, and there's nothing wrong in being utilitarian here. You might be incomplete in your reasoning, but there's nothing wrong. And I think the best example of that would be the standard review. Now, some of you might have seen this standard review, but for those of you who have not seen this standard review, I tell you, it's a very simple calculation. It's a calculation that the costs of climate change can go from 5% of global GDP to up to 20% of global GDP, and that would go in terms of reduction in food production and loss in productivity, water shortage, and the impact on health that we might find, coastal flooding. So the list is big. And so that would be the cost in terms of negative impact of climate change. And then Stern, and we are talking about more than 10 years, we're talking about 2007, the Stern report has prepared a list of impacts and has seen what is necessary to mend, to fix, to provide solutions for these issues. And according to him and his team, it was about 1% of global GDP. So it's a very straightforward, a very simple, a very clear calculation, cost-benefit. The cost would be in terms of damaging, that can go from 5 to 20%, and then the benefit, in this case, which is what we would have if we don't have the damage. Yeah, so that's how we have to read it. And then what would actually cost would be around 1%. We put 1% to save from 5 to 20%. And why from 5 to 20%? Because that's one of the features of climate change, the level of uncertainty. Now, we are talking about here getting up to 550 parts per million. And we are talking here about reduction of 80% of past levels of CO2. So that's one thing that is important to keep in mind, that even in utilitarian terms, we might get that. Now, not all change would qualify. So we have to know what are the characteristics of climate change. Now, the first thing is that climate change is an externality. No one wants to produce climate change. Climate change is an unintended consequence of something else. Now, but climate in itself is a public good. Now, it's common to find people in the exams saying just the opposite. They say, oh, no, the climate is an externality. No, climate is good. Yeah. What happens, the change is an externality. It's also important to acknowledge that this is a different form of externality. So partially because it's global, and it's global in terms of causes, it's global also in terms of consequences. Causes and consequences are not in the same place. You're going to find the causes in places where CO2 emissions are higher, so in industrial countries, but also, well, there are many different sources for that. Countries where people are flying a lot, for instance, in countries where people are burning their forests as well. And then the consequences not always will happen nearby, and that's the global nature, yeah? So probably someone using air conditioning, I'm just going to use the example that the Human Development Report uses, someone using air conditioning in Florida, in the US, will affect someone in Peru. Yeah, so they do not have to be nearby. It's also important that these impacts, they are persistent and they develop over time. So there's a gap in terms. CO2 today does not mean that something will happen immediately tomorrow, because it depends on the accumulation, it depends on the mechanisms, how climate change will happen. And it's because of this gap which is very difficult for policy making. Most of the models, most of the policy making models we are used to, they are like a lever. So you do A and B happens immediately. For all those of you who have done ISLM, LM for macro, or any other kind of microeconomic models as well, they are very mechanic. But here is different because we have gaps and we do have gaps depending on different ecosystems as well. So, but these impacts, they develop over time. And when they happen, in terms of their size, in terms of their timing, we know that uncertainties are considerable. As before, Stern was saying, well, perhaps the cost can go up to 5% of global GDP, or perhaps it's 20%. So the level of uncertainty is very, very, very high. So people know that this will happen, but the extension, it depends on other variables, and that's part of the complexity of climate change, part of the difficulty in assessing and asserting the effects as well. Now, this means that changes, they are not going to be continuous, and you can have some non-marginal changes as well. So these are the key characteristics of climate change. Of course, this is much more difficult if we have to compare people today with people tomorrow, because we don't know how to aggregate the well-being. We have to define what would be the rate of discount that we are going to use to bring these people from the future today, or take people today and take them to the future. So that's another very interesting discussion that in the case of the Stern review, Stern was very adamant. We should not discount people's well-being from the future, and we should consider, so another way of saying that is that we should use a zero rate of discount, because if we don't do so, even if we use a very small rate in the future, it will amount to nothing today. So sometimes things are a little bit more complex, and they do depend on value judgments. This is a question that is not up to economists, not even to scientists, to define what's the rate of discount of well-being of people in the future. How you're going to discount the well-being of your children, of your grandchildren. So perhaps the most sensible thing is to avoid discounting. But some philosophers will all be very adamant on that as well. They will say we cannot discount the well-being of people that they might exist or not, because we have trends for fertility and other things, but fertility rates, but we don't know. Yeah, so that's one thing. So then I would like to call your attention to what it's slide for projected impacts of climate change. And there are two pieces of information that are very important here. The first, you can read that vertically. You can say, look, we know that the impacts are on food and water and the preservation of ecosystems. But it's also about some weather events and whether some of these changes are going to be irreversible. So we know this vertically. But it's also important to know them horizontally, because climate change is not simply a qualitative issue. It's also a quantitative issue. It's a question of degree. If temperature increases, as scientists believe that would be the best case scenario for all of us, if they increase around 2 degrees Celsius, so far so good. Some people are going, especially people living in rural areas, in dryland areas, they might have their crops affected at the same time that some people who live in developed regions might see some new areas losing this sort of snow cover, and they might use that for agriculture. So, but as this thing extends and expands to 3 and 4 and more, so the impact on food production, especially among the poorest of the poor, who will be the most affected, might be dramatic. So also keep in mind that our health depends very much on the quality of food we have. So it's not simply about any food. It's about healthy food is about undermining the conditions for the poor having crops and having a proper livelihood, on issues that will be totally independent from what they do. That's the first thing. So the second thing, when we talk about water, is very visible that for certain parts of the world, they do not have their mountains, they do not have the ice cover or top as they used to have. This means that during the summer they will not receive as much water as they used to. So, very important point, because life depends on water, that if the water that's running from the mountains is affected because of global warming, if somehow the availability of water, because it changes how rain happens, especially in developing countries, but not only, if somehow the sea level threatens areas where people depend on these areas for their livelihood, so this also might be really, really dangerous in terms of people's livelihood and the number of undernourished people in the world, around 850, 900 million people, as some of you might have seen. Yeah, another thing, in addition to food and water, is just the integrity of ecosystems. And I think you might have seen before the discussion of the damage of coral reefs because water becomes warmer. This means that it's impossible for some microorganisms to live close to these coral reefs. So this corresponds to the death of these microorganisms and then the bleaching of coral reefs. Now, and this is important because coral reefs, they in the food chain, they would be important for bigger animals or bigger fish, and then other fish would have their conditions of living affected. So there is a whole chain which depends on the disruption because of the temperature of the water, depends on the existence of microorganisms and sea life as well. Yeah. Now, when it comes to extreme weather events, it's important to mention that for a very simple reason, is that some people misunderstand the nature of climate change, saying that climate change will cause things. But more often than not, climate change doesn't cause extreme weather events, but it magnifies extreme weather events. Now, I tell you one case that happened to me when I was in the US many years ago. So we had seen, as we see all the time, some tropical storms increasing and then going through Cuba, and then they go to the Atlantic, and then they go to the US. And back in 2012, there was one called Sandy. And I remember that we prepared. We knew that Sandy would hit the coast of the US where we were. And we thought, well, it's okay. We have food. We have water. We are going to stay inside. Nothing will happen. Well, there are still some things to finish, but we can finish them perhaps tomorrow morning, because people are predicting that this storm will arrive, will become a hurricane and will arrive in the afternoon. Now, and then we went to bed. When we woke up in the next morning, everything was totally destroyed. Now, we did not understand why the predictions got it wrong, and the explanation was clear. When then Sandy got to the Atlantic, scientists did not realize that the Atlantic waters would be much, much warmer. Because they were warmer, so the speed increased a lot, So it was quicker and it was bigger. And then some of you might remember what happened to New Jersey um, uh, because of Sandy. But the point is that that's what we can expect, that because of these unseen, unpredicted conditions, some weather events might become extreme or more extreme. And because of these non-linearities, there are many discontinuities that might happen. So when we talk about the impacts of climate change, these impacts, they are all multidimensional. Now, I included for you a list of these impacts on food security, just for you to have an idea. And why food security? Because perhaps that's the most basic of all. You can start realizing that the problem of climate change is that as much as we might be exposed to the same risk, we are not equally vulnerable. So especially when we talk about food security, would be those countries in the worst, the most vulnerable conditions that will see increases in hunger over time because of climate change. So this will just make things worse. And you know that when they hit children, the impact that they have over their lives tends to be persistent, and sometimes these negative consequences, they tend to increase over time. So and for most of those countries, they are not in a position to tackle these issues when they happen. So issues of malnutrition, issues of undernutrition, they will have an impact over people's lives. So so this is important when we talk about food security. This means that to a certain extent, it's not simply about poverty, but inequalities related to that. So what we call food inequalities will not affect people to the same extent in the world. So food inequalities will increase, and especially might become harder for the poor in rural areas in developing countries, but the relatively rich in urban areas in developed countries might be the last to see the effects. Now, the level of vulnerability, this means that the level of vulnerability of the very poor will increase. And when this happens, one very important feature of these ecosystems might be affected, because ecosystems, they are important because of their degree of resilience. Resilience is their capacity to react to shocks and then return to the same starting point. So the capacity of the ecosystems to return to the same starting point will be decreasing over time as well. Now, all these main points about food security, they have a timing for that. And we are talking about a period of 20 to 30 years for preventing climate change to produce some of these negative results. If not, then the divide that we see today between the haves and the have-nots will go to a different level. Now, you could say, oh, okay, so but this, Flavio, you're talking about people who are living in rural areas, isn't it? Well, yeah, mostly. But what about people who are living in cities? What happens that people who are living in cities, the predictions that, and it's very interesting because they do predictions for cities, for particular cities, is that probably these cities will become what they call heat stressed. And then some cities will get 2 degrees, other cities will get 3 degrees Celsius more in terms of their temperature. And this would affect not simply the health of the elderly, of the children, but for adults overall. Now, in order to keep that temperature at a stable level, this means that that planned reduction of 80% will have to happen. So people should think that the quality of their air and then the energy spending in air conditioning, especially in big cities, should change in the future. Now, hopefully this is clear. So hopefully trying to understand these divides when we talk about climate change, you might understand that this is the essence of what we are discussing. So it's not simply something that's going on and that will affect a box, a section of what is going on over there. No, it's not. It's something which has deep impacts on the way we organize society, or the societies are organized. This will have a much deeper impact on issues such as poverty and inequality. And just to make these things even clearer, then I have added to you the Human Development Report 2007 and 8. There are studies after that, but they repeat partially the main message of this report, and this report puts things in a very, very clear way. Yeah. So let me repeat what would be the main characteristics of climate change. Yeah. We said before it was global. We said before it had some gaps. Now we said before that things, when they happen, they are not important for the flow because they are cumulative. So it's because the stocks of CO2, gigatons of CO2, they are increasing, that we cannot change these things from today to tomorrow. Now normally when I'm in class, I joke with you. Well, I don't know whether it's a good joke, but I would joke and I would say, now, I would mention that I got married 16 years ago, and I would ask you whether my wife would ask me tomorrow to wear the suit I was wearing when we got married, whether you think that, well, I would wear that. Or you cannot see my tummy now, yeah? But then in class, most people would say, not sure, yeah? And then I would say, that's the same analogy, yeah? That's the cumulative problem, because we are accumulating CO2 when the effects will happen, when the impacts will happen. You cannot change from one day to the other. It's impossible. Now, if you give me 6 months, perhaps, yeah, I can go on diet, I can exercise, and perhaps I can be slim again, yeah? But and this is just an analogy, but when we have those gigatons of CO2 and we start seeing all those impacts that we have discussed before, we cannot change them quickly. So the fact that they are irreversible is not they are irreversible per se, but they are irreversible within a sort of policy time frame in which they could have any consequence. That's why you will see politicians and policymakers saying we have to act now. And most people would not understand why do we have to act now. Now, we have to act now because this is cumulative. And if we don't do anything before the most serious impacts start, when they start, they are not reversible, as it would not be very easy for me to wear that suit. Yeah. Now, what happens today will be tomorrow's problems. So that's the main issue to highlight to you. Now, you have seen all the graphs, you have seen the benchmarks, so they are there for you in these slides, but I'm not going to repeat them here. But I would like to mention that for the future, things do not look good. Now, we do have a slide which is called 21st Century Carbon Budget is set for early expiry. And the main issue here is that there are some trends that have been projected. They have been projected for, given a level of population growth, Yeah, the higher the population growth, the higher the number of people, the higher would be CO2 emissions. Now they are projected for a level of technology that could save or not, but just imagine that it depends on technology and it depends on economic growth. These are the three most important parameters of these projections. Now, when you look at this graph, you're going to see that they all go up. So it's not a question that for the future the carbon budget will expire. It's not. The question is when. And what you can see in this graph is that the gaps, they increase. Now, what would be the sustainable path, which is the line on black, is something that is very distant, and it will become even more within the next 10 years. So if nothing is achieved within the next 10 years, so the projections for the future, they are going to become more negative in comparison to what could be done. So the timing is the essence of the matter here when we talk about climate change. That's why I repeat, you see people saying that we have to act now. But in order to distribute those sacrifices, this is very tricky, because although these projections would take into account that developing countries, they can increase a little bit, for most developed countries, they will have to reduce dramatically. They would have to cut by 80% by 2050 their emissions. Now, new technologies are helping on that, but there's no technological fix. So that's the nature of what we are discussing. And some countries considered developing countries, they are developing very quickly. Think about China and India here. And then we might have another level of difficulties. Now, inequality, it's still at the core of this discussion. Now think about the UK population, around 16 million people, and it has a level of emission, of CO2 emission, that is higher than Egypt, Nigeria, Pakistan and Vietnam together, and they have a population which is almost 500 million. But if you consider only one region, only one state, such as the state of Texas in the US, and they are a little bit more than 20 million people, they have a deeper footprint than almost 700 plus million people in sub-Saharan Africa. But if you think about New York, yeah, with its 20 million people, it has a deeper footprint than a similar number of people, 700 plus million people, who are living in the 50 least developed countries. Now, the message behind that is that no strategy that would ask for sacrifice in a linear way might work. And that's part of the problem, because there are some coordination difficulties among countries. What would be the best thing for countries here? Would be if everyone does and no one will ask you to do. Yeah, so you can free ride. So that would be the rationale behind that. But there are some countries that they are too important to free ride, because what they do matters to the global emission of CO2. So the difficulty here is very complex, because it depends not simply, as we said before, in terms of denial of ideology. Even if people know their figures, they believe in what the scientists are saying, we do have political issues of, okay, so who is going to pay what, or paying for what in this discussion, and this is something that should not be ignored. So how can we understand the real difficulty that the poor would have in that? Now, I would like to suggest that we have two concepts which are key to this discussion: the concept of risk and the concept of vulnerability. Now, we do have gaps in risks. There are people who are more exposed to climate change than others would be. But also, if we were to consider that people would be exposed to the same risk, so people in Bangladesh and people in the Netherlands, they could be equally at risk of floods. Yeah? Even if this is the case, we should consider that they are not equally vulnerable. And what the concept of vulnerability does is that it measures one's capacity to manage hazards without suffering any long-term, potentially irreversible loss of human well-being. So some of you might have seen those movies by Rocky. I think it was, the guy was called Rocky Balboa, the boxer. Yeah, you know how it goes. Yeah, so fight going on, you think the boxer, well, they're killing the guy is going to die. But then somehow he finds the energy, he finds the will to fight, and he defeats in spite of all the odds. Yeah, and then everyone celebrates. And now resilience is about that. Resiliency is about suffering and falling and standing again. So the difficulty with climate change, I repeat, is not simply that there are gaps at different levels that people are at risk, but even if they have the same risk, you have the rich and you have the poor, and the poor are much more vulnerable. So they cannot cope, and they will not be able to cope with those climate hazards without suffering long-term irreversible losses. So for all those trends we have seen before, I think in our past lectures we have seen that we do have an additional issue to take into account here, which is based on the difference between risk and vulnerability. So to a certain extent, this is less of a problem for the rich, because the rich, they are going to live in places we are not going to be at the risk of droughts and floods and all problems that will come as a consequence or different consequence of climate change. At the same time, the poor, and think about that 40% of the poor in the world, they live in dry land areas, so they are most at risk. But it's not simply that, it's that they are most vulnerable. Now when the rich, they get ill, they might have any form of insurance, health insurance. But when the poor, they get ill and they have to sell their assets just to pay for treatments, they might not have what they have before. Yeah. So risk and vulnerability, they are essential concepts for us to understand this relative impact. And in addition to that, we know that what could be a positive human development trend might trap people for climate events that will happen today. So they might fall into spirals of disadvantage that might undermine what will happen to them in the future. So some examples to you. Yeah, one example that comes from Ethiopia: children exposed to droughts in early childhood are almost 40% more likely to be malnourished 5 years later. And we are talking about 2 million people, 2 million children here. So at the same time, get an Indian woman born during a drought or a flood. Studies that accompany these women from the 70s have seen that they were almost 20% less likely to attend primary school. So one thing that happens to you if you are in that position is not that people are starving at that moment, is that the whole human development path is undermined. So and people, they end up in a trap. Now let me repeat how these things would happen. Now, and that's what we call the mechanisms or the tipping points. Now the most straightforward mechanism would be food production. And this food production might come or not with a reduction in agricultural productivity. Now sometimes people might even choose, poor farmers might even choose, if they have one seed that is less productive but more resilient, and another seed which is much more productive but is less resilient, well, they are very poor. They would say, well, I prefer to have something than to have nothing. I'm not going to choose, it's not rational to choose a seed that is not resilient, even if it's less productive. And this has been going on. Another thing which happens is water insecurity. And, well, we all think that everyone in the world will have enough water. But in fact, we have 1 billion people without proper water for their daily consumption, which means it's lower than 20 liters per person. And if you are a little bit more generous, if you extend that water poverty line to 40 liters, we get to 2 billion people in the world. So when even that 40 liters, well, I would guess that probably you would be using 150, 160 liters per day. So this increase in water security, water insecurity might have stronger impacts on the health of the very poor. Not to mention, as I mentioned before, the increase in frequency and exposure to extreme weather events of all sorts. And if you just open the newspapers, well, not newspapers, you might open your tablet, your computer, and then you see the news. So I meant not literally. So, but you just see the news, so you are going to see that extreme weather events, they are taking place right here, right now. And the number of people dying just for this month that I'm here in Brazil, the state of Minas Gerais, which is at the center, is one of the colonial regions that the Portuguese, they have colonized. They started colonizing Brazil for that region. You're going to find one of the nicest churches there. All the city of Belo Horizonte has been washed away by rain, and I think around 60 people have died in the last 2 weeks, and they are among the poorest of the poor in the city because they cannot afford living in different places. So they have a higher risk, they have no place to go, and some people have lost their houses. Well, we don't know how they are going to live. Now, overall, this will also come in terms of tipping points with collapse of ecosystems. We have discussed about the bleaching, the coral bleaching before, and then overall the question of health risks. But let me give you another example for health risks, because otherwise you might think that it's only through water. In the past, one of the coolest areas of Africa would be Nairobi in Kenya. But more recently, because of climate change, now Nairobi is becoming warmer. And you might say, so what's the problem? What's the health risk of Nairobi? It's a very nice city, by the way. What's the problem of becoming warmer? Now the problem is that they did not have malaria before. And malaria was increasing in the outskirts of Nairobi. Now I don't know how is Nairobi today, but at the time I used to go to Nairobi because of a project with UNEP. That problem had started. So it's something which doesn't happen only through water. So it's more complex than that. So I have added some graphs showing to you the figures of how climate change will hurt agriculture, especially in developing countries. I have added also some figures about glacial melting there, because poor populations living in arid coastal arid areas of Peru, but also in the Hindus. So there are many different areas in the world that scientists have estimated the reduction in terms of fresh water, and the numbers, they are dramatic. The potential for some of these regions to become dryland areas. When we have seen only what scientists have, and we are going to talk more about that in the next lecture, but when we see what are the outcomes of extreme weather events, they are all big numbers. For instance, we get tropical storms, and the figure of people affected by an increase in temperature, which can go up to 3 to 4 degrees, is almost 400 million. Or for all those areas subject to flooding, like Egypt or Vietnam or Bangladesh. So we are talking about 6 million in Egypt, 22 million in Vietnam, almost 18% of area covered in Bangladesh, and 11% of the population. So all the forecasts here, the numbers of the forecasts, they're really, really concerning. So you might think, okay, so I understood the issue. How can we avoid that? Now, basically, there are two things that can be done. Either mitigation, which is reduction, or adaptation. If we cannot solve, we are going to adapt. So these two things are the things that can be achieved. Yeah. So when we talk about mitigation, we go to the core, the quintessential issue for policy making. Shall we use markets? Shall we use governments to solve that? Now, people who believe that markets can work, is just a question of giving proper price to carbon. Because by doing that, so their reasoning is that because carbon has a price of 0, so you have an excess of negative externalities because it has no cost, it has no price. When it has a price, things can change. So it's just a question of defining proper markets, and this has been, well, people have been doing that for the last 30 years, and see what happens. And the outcomes are okay, but they do not change dramatically, these issues. The pricing carbon has very limited impact considered. Now, the other thing would be in terms of the role of public policy. And so public policy can be exercised through regulations, through legislation, and then some people would say, perhaps the governments are not very efficient in the way they do that. And this debate goes to what is considered taxation versus cap and trade. Yeah, the idea of taxation is simple. Let's change the price. But if you change the price, this does not mean that people will stop consuming that. It's just that people will pay more for that. But perhaps people are willing to pay more for their carbon. So yeah, what about cap and trade? You have a cap, so you have a limit, and then you can trade those permits. Yeah. Now the difficulty is just the opposite, because these rights to emit, they might have some distributive impacts depending on the prices, how the prices go. So at the very end, those people who might need that, they might not have enough. So there's a critical point here, but I would like to suggest to you that, as all ideological debate, we should try in a very pragmatic way to try to see what is there that we can use. When the problems are really tough, really dramatic, such as climate change, why not use some governmental tools, some taxation and regulation, and see what government action can achieve, or what it can achieve for the energy mix in society, what are the incentives that can be given to the residential sector, or what in terms of vehicle standards, how they can change to comply with a better quality of life and lower emissions. At the same time, that one would allow some institutional answers that can be operationalized via markets. So now, sadly, when we look at CO2 emissions, well, the prospects are not terribly pretty. That's why some people say, let's adapt to what is inevitable. So it's just a question of achieving international cooperation. See, it's a global problem. We cannot solve them nationally. Perhaps part of the problem is that we are trying to solve an international, a global issue only nationally. And that was in the direction in which the Paris Agreement and the sequence of other agreements have been achieved. Now, the difficulty here is that, well, it's nice to have the agreements, but if you don't have actual resources to implement the plans, such as flood defenses and then emergency services that can help people in different parts of the world when they are struck by the impacts of climate change, or then long-term alternatives for some countries, or then even relocation, if the money is not there, because it's still not much what people are spending. So all discussion in terms of investment that would go in infrastructure, in social protection, in disaster response will not be there. And then the inequalities would still be pervasive. So that's why people, today, there are many people who talk about climate injustice. The notion of climate injustice is precisely that. Is that climate change will not affect everyone equally. People will not provide the same level, will not show the same level of resilience that they will have, and then we are only going to increase the divide. So it's perhaps the biggest issue of our times, partially because it's an issue about justice. It's an issue about equality. It's at the same time, it's a deeply human issue to be discussed by us. It's not simply up to the environment what will happen. It's what we do to us as well. Yeah. Now, I hope this is clear. Let's move now to a more specific discussion about sustainability and ecosystem services. But if it's not, if there are any things which are unclear, I'm glad to answer them, either to put another video as I did before, or perhaps to answer in person during the supervisions. Yeah. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.